We start and on time. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, welcome, and thank you all for joining us today for this Bravo Leadership Conversation. We hope everyone is well and staying healthy. We're happy to see so many familiar faces, although virtually, for this year's version of our Council of the Americas Symposium and Bravo series. For the past couple of months, we've been hosting dialogues with great leaders that are shaping Latin America's reality during such critical times. Before we introduce today's program and amazing guests, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Bank of America, the AES Corporation, MasterCard, SAP, SoftTech, Chubb Latin America, HSB Securities, INC, and Microsoft, our partners at the Inter-American Development Bank, and our media sponsors, America's Quarterly, CNN Español, and the Financial Times. So today we are very happy to be hosting two leaders and great believers in the power of technology to transform Latin America. So it's my pleasure to introduce today Luis Alberto Moreno, who is the president at the Inter-American Development Bank and has done so much for the hemisphere over his tenure at that organization. And of course, Marcelo Claure, CEO at SoftBank Group International, who has been investing in technology around the world and has just committed a huge fund to support technology in Latin America. Welcome to both of you. Now, they will have a conversation, Marcelo and Luis Alberto, for approximately 40 minutes, and then our audience will have an opportunity to ask questions to our speakers towards the end of the program. If you want to ask a question, please send an email to Ariana Molina at amolina@as-coa.org. And with that, let me pass the floor to Marcelo, of course, virtually. Marcelo, the floor is yours, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for doing this. I definitely want to thank you and the Council of the Americas for hosting today's conversation. The last time we saw each other, if I'm not mistaken, all of us, we were at the UN Assembly in New York City last September. And I think we could have never imagined of what the world has turned, what is happening in Latin America. So I'm just so happy to reconnect and to be able to see you and Luis again. I'm happy to host this series with Luis. Luis is a person who, from my younger years, I've always admired. There's a leader who has reshaped Latin America. And I think someone I can share with us so much. Having been on the IDB for close to 15 years, I guess he's seen all sort of things, all sort of leaders, all sort of economies, all sort of promises, all sort of crashes. I think the only thing that Luis hasn't seen is a pandemic that has affected or that nobody could have ever predicted. Hope the world will be back to normal in the not so distant future, and we can have these sessions in person at the organization that you lead, Susan. Also, I want to thank all the people who registered. I was asking how many people have taken the time to register, and the fact that 500 people, probably because of Luis Alberto, not because of me, that have been so gracious to actually register and be ready to ask questions. And I understand that this event is also being live streamed, so that is great. So we have a lot to talk with Luis Alberto, so why don't we get started? So a few questions that I have, right? Some say that the more things change, the more things stay the same. You as president of the IDB have an incredible view of Latin America, privileged view of Latin America. And one of the things that a lot of us just live the present, and you've had the experience that you've seen this Latin America. And I wanted to ask you, what are the big changes that you've seen in Latin America in the last 10 years? The big changes that have redefined Latin America?
For this conversation and to thank you. As I was listening to Marcelo, I was reminded that I first met Marcelo about 14 years ago. He could hardly be, 35, 36. And one of my colleagues at the bank said, you got to meet this guy who has this amazing business selling cell phones. And as I talked to Marcelo, I was so taken aback and so happy, and I actually went out and wrote an article about saying this should be the new face of Latin America. But of course, if I went to read that article, I never imagined that Marcelo would go as far as he's done. And so I'm really happy and proud as a Latin American for everything that he's accomplished. And thank you for being here. When I think, Marcelo, on your question, I've been 15 years of the bank. I'll be finishing at the end of the month. And when I think back, 15 years ago was a time that everything seemed to be going right. We had huge wins to our sales. Asian and especially Chinese demand for commodities were huge. Prices of commodities were very high. This allowed countries to begin to accumulate huge amounts of reserves, to begin to close fiscal deficits, to put all kinds of programs, as you might recall, the most visible one being the Bolsa Familia, but there are other programs like that that were all over Latin America. The IDB had a lot to do with those programs. And you truly saw the beginning of what was essentially a huge change in the social conditions of Latin America. We always see the glass half empty, half full, but the reality is that there were close to 100 million people that essentially moved out of either extreme poverty or out of poverty and into the middle classes, defined by more than $10 a day of income. Then came the financial crisis. And the financial crisis was, of course, for the developed world, a huge correction, but equally was very, very tough on emerging markets. The difference being that it was largely because emerging markets and their pre-existing conditions, if I might, that they were able to turn around very quickly. And the reality is that countries in Latin America, we saw all of them come into recession, but the following year was truly a V-shaped recovery. But the consequences of that financial crisis began to be manifested in a number of ways. And we went through the last 5 years, really perhaps with one of our lowest growth rates in many, many years. And that came along with equally a lot of people who already had moved out of poverty, who were seeing the quality of public services that they were insufficient to their aspirations and frankly to the quality they expected. And that put people into the streets. And we saw all of the manifestations of this starting in Chile and everywhere else. And it was kind of that sense that we've seen. And so kind of when I see all of this period, I also see a period in which we began at the IDB, and something Marcelo has done a lot about, is this whole question of technology. Because I thought back, we missed the train of the Industrial Revolution. We cannot miss the train of the technological revolution. And we started to see a lot of very interesting things happening. And certainly, if anything, this COVID crisis has only accelerated the need to do much, much more in this space. Marcelo knows well his country in Bolivia. Unfortunately, be it poor or rich, you still have very low access to bandwidth. And the little that you have is at very high price and very low speeds. And you need exactly the contrary, and to have it for the whole of the population. So that's kind of the different moments I've seen in Latin America. And of course, today is certainly one of the most profound changes we have seen in our lifetime. And this time is truly different. And I think we're in a moment of a tremendous transition the world over. And how we decide to shape this, how do governments and civil society and businesses decide to take this on in a moment of profound change and constant change and probably a lot of trial and error. This is the period we're entering in. And it's going to be a period that is going to be very, very challenging in Latin America.
All right, so I'll confess first of all, Luis Alberto, it's a pleasure to see you in a shirt without a suit and a tie. So you look very different to me today. That's really good. But I'll share a story. When I was thinking of opening the Latin American Technology Fund that we opened, the 5 billion technology fund, I remember having a conversation with you in DC that probably was one of the turning points in deciding to do this. And that's the fact that you have become the leading source of development finance in Latin America. But the problem was development financing without equity financing in many cases is not enough. And I was very happy to count the bank as having a partner that in many cases, as we went to companies that wanted to grow, they were talking to the IDB in terms, hey, the IDB is going to provide financing to us and we would provide the necessary equity so they would have a strong balance sheet. And I think that's what made you great. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what would be the key decisions, the 3 decisions that you made during your tenure that basically contribute to the transformation of Latin America? And probably what are you, as you're going to finish an amazing 15-year tenure, what are you most proud of? What were those big decisions that you made that as you move on to other things, you're going to remember and always talk about the big things that you've done?
Well, look, I mean, the first tough decision I took, and believe me, I know you've gone through this a number of times, is I came to the bank and it really required a generational change. And that meant a big restructuring. And, you read all these books about what you should not do. And then all of a sudden you start doing all these changes and you find yourself that you're doing exactly what you should not do. Because when you do big changes in organizations, you can never forget the people aspect. And so there were mistakes that I made there, but overall, that essentially allowed us to bring a lot of new blood into the bank. A lot of people who were into the trenches really moved up the organization, and that was a very important moment. Another very difficult moment because it wasn't, right about the time of the international financial crisis. The bank required more capital, and the whole process of getting more capital with 48 governments is always a difficult one. But we were lucky enough to get the support of all our shareholders, and we essentially were able to double our capital. Another big decision was a little bit of what you were talking about, which was, how do we deal best with the private sector? So we created we already had a very small, what we call then the Inter-American Investment Corporation that lent close to $150, $200 million a year to especially SMEs. And we eventually, put more capital into that, substantial capital increase from all our shareholders. And that led to the fact that today, this year, we'll be lending $7 billion. And, we're also doing equity. We then, our IDB lab, which is our innovation lab, we again found more capital for it. So those moments were important. But equally, the fact that you, push the organization far more to the field, you simplified processes, and constantly be able to, to do things and be innovative around areas such as climate change, which is a huge, huge challenge for our hemisphere. We are about 8% in terms of world's population, about 12% in terms of the land mass, but we represent over 40% of the biodiversity of the world. So we did a lot in that space. We did a lot in the space of technology in private sector. And another very important thing that we must never forget is all the issues surrounding gender. I think this is a hemisphere that requires far more in the way of gender diversity in diversity in general, and that the bank not only looks a lot like the hemisphere, but that we are able to put an agenda forward that understands, that gender and diversity are central parts of modern society, and more importantly, as you know very well, Marcelo, institutions want you to represent what they want to feel, that not only do they have a sense of purpose, people working for you, but that you're standing up for things that you as an institution believe, but more importantly, your colleagues believe as well.
Luis Alberto, one of the things that is worrisome is that Latin America today, 6 of the top 12 countries with confirmed cases of COVID are Latin America. And my worry, and I think the worry of a lot of investors in Latin America, is what's going to happen? How long are these effects going to last in our region? And how long do you think, as you're always evaluating more data than anybody else, is how long do you think it'll take for the region to recover and get back to where we were in a pre-pandemic crisis?
Well, this is the question of our day. I mean, it's very hard to know when that's going to happen. I mean, just in terms of numbers, we are now, we have had close to a little bit over a third of the cases around the world, a bit less in terms of deaths. And the numbers for the first time are starting to come down, but not in every country. There's countries which the numbers are still going up, like Argentina or lately in Costa Rica. So we've had a very hard time containing the spread of the virus. And this has a lot to do with who we are as society. Because when you have so much poverty, so many people in informal labor markets, people living in very dense areas, all in a home, all of that makes it very difficult. And clearly, it is the poorest who are paying the biggest price because it becomes a choice between, food and or going hungry and or getting COVID. And so that added to the fact that this is a very inexact science. I mean, the reality is that the countries that have managed this well have done a number of things. First of all, there's been a tremendous social discipline, which people wear masks, wash their hands, keep social distance. But above all, governments have been able to do huge amount of testing and equally do a lot of tracing and tracking. And when countries are able to do that, you get countries like Vietnam, which has had less than 500 deaths in a population of 50 million people, or countries like South Korea or Singapore and others, have been largely countries that have been able to manage it well. In our hemisphere, you have countries like, for instance, Uruguay, who's managed this tremendously well, and is already starting. People are back on the streets, people are working, and they've been able to control the spread of the virus. To your question, how long will it take? Actually, have an op-ed that I wrote today in the Financial Times that basically says, we had the chance back 10 years ago to truly have a decade that could have been the best decade for Latin America. We had a lot of tailwinds in our favor, but we equally had to do a lot of the very significant structural reforms that unfortunately not every country did them. And now things like technology, things like where our growth is going to come from, those are going to be the single most important issues. And governments are going to be much bigger today as a percent of GDP than they were before. So it's going to require that the private sector works in the same side of the table as governments. It's going to require serious investments in technology because, today the poorest do not have access. Maybe they have bandwidth, but it costs them 10 to 15% of their salary to pay up to have a smartphone and to be connected. These are the kinds of things that have to become public goods to be able to support this moment. I mean, on the other hand, and I'm sure this is something you follow very closely, we now are, I don't know if 5 years ahead or 3 years ahead or however many years in terms of advancing in technological issues. But let me turn over to you, Marcelo, because I think this is the one question I would love to ask of you. I mean, here you are with a tremendous view of the world, with your fingers in a number of businesses. And when you think about not only what you did with your fund in investing already in Latin America, but how do you see, and this is going to be not only Latin America, in the whole emerging world, is the speed with which countries can internalize and can begin to do teleworking is a luxury in our countries. It is a necessity in the developed world. How do you see all of this playing out?
So I'll give you the Latin American context, right? And first and foremost, you've addressed a very big issue that we have is technology needs bandwidth, and unfortunately, Latin America is lagging behind in many of the technology investments that we need. So, for example, when you look at the cost per gigabyte that our people in Latin America still have to pay, is extremely high. So, in a world that we're living today, where most of the world has somewhat adapted to what we're doing, to be able to work from home or be able, you need to have access to technology. So, I think from that end, we still have a long way to go. And countries that don't have a bandwidth problem and have high speeds and have lower cost to access the internet or are going to be able to do better. Now, when I look at this pandemic, there are a few things that are going to change forever, right? I mean, I think the massive digitalization of the services of the SMBs, of the enterprises, are being accelerated everywhere in the world. Often people joke and say the best CTO or the best chief technology officer the company ever had, it was called COVID pandemic, because it has forced us to digitalize the way we work, the way we live, and that has given the rise of a whole set of new different type of companies that are now basically thriving. Right? Who was ever going to think that you would have a company like Zoom that is the growth that they have experienced, the market cap that they have is enormous because they offer something as simple as an easy video conferencing, which we can communicate. So companies like Cisco and others completely missed the boat in terms of digitalizing and making video conferencing available for everybody else. So you start seeing companies, some of the world's most valuable companies are companies that provide such a simple service, and that is to send a shopper on your behalf to a supermarket so they can pretty much pick up your groceries and deliver to your home. A company like Instacart, or companies like in Latin America, like Rappi, who basically have deployed, hundreds of thousands of couriers who are basically picking up food and delivering to your home. So I would say the negative side of the pandemic, you have the death, you have the economic contraction, but on the positive side is Latin America has amazing entrepreneurs who have taken advantage of this pandemic to create companies that are incredible. I mean, you look at the Mercado Libre example in Latin America, who's one of the world's most valuable companies by being able to provide e-commerce and payment solutions to the tens of millions of Latin America who now use Mercado Libre. The same happens to Rappi, and the same happens to many other different companies in Latin America. So from our end, we're looking forward to eventually having vaccines out and going back to to a world that's going to be different forever, but has given the emergence. It has accelerated the deployment of technology in emerging markets like Latin America.
I was astonished to find that for many years, yeah, the IDB helped support a number of venture capital funds, but there was never really, given the size of our economies, a lot of venture capital. At best, you correct me, there were, I don't know, a little bit over $1 billion. When you came in, you basically filled the pool and you had more, funding. Talk to us about the quality of entrepreneurs. You see entrepreneurs in the tech space around the world. Talk to us about all these young entrepreneurs that one finds around Latin America. How do you compare them to other parts of the world? And how fast do you see their businesses becoming more global and being able to develop new solutions around all the different challenges that we have in the region?
Yeah. So let me start talking about Latin America, right? When I started looking at Latin America, one thing that really, really bothered me was the fact that Latin America is only half the size of China, right? And it's 2x the size of India from a GDP perspective, but the funding that we have for venture capital or for investment in our entrepreneurs was so small, right? You look at Latin America, when we came in, I think in 2018, the total funding was $2 billion, and China's funding was to the tune of $107 billion. So it made no sense. How could China have 50 times the amount of funding when the GDP was only 2 times? Or how could India have a 10 billion funding, 5 times the size of Latin America, when our economy was basically 2 times the size of India? And I realized, and I started traveling in Latin America. I traveled to Brazil, I traveled to Mexico, I traveled to Argentina, I traveled to Colombia. And I found that the quality of the Latin American entrepreneur was basically as good as any entrepreneur that we've seen in China, that we've seen in India, that we've seen in other places. But the main problem that they had is they didn't have access to venture. They didn't have access to equity funding. So they ran bootstrap business, were scared to grow, and were so scared of that there was not going to be enough money in the next round of funding that they really had very little aspirations. And I think a wake-up call to everybody was when Rappi came in, right? We look at Rappi and we saw the incredible potential of 2 Colombian entrepreneurs, and we made the first or the largest venture investment ever. We invested $1 billion into Rappi through a combination of our Latin American fund and our Vision fund. And then you see the results. I mean, Rappi has continued to grow. Rappi has penetrated more and more markets. Rappi is turning into the super app of Latin America, where it's not only solving, the basic food delivery, but it's solving many of the other daily needs that customers have. So, and then we continue to travel, and we found amazing entrepreneurs through Latin America that were disrupting the transportation industry, that were disrupting logistics, that were disrupting real estate, that were disrupting especially the fintech or the banking, the incredibly profitable banking system in Latin America that was being just pretty much managed by a few banks that were disrupting enterprise, consumer, and so on. So what I can tell you is, this has been amazing, right? Just in this year alone, we plan to invest, I think we're going to be up to $2 billion. We have invested in 20 amazing companies. We have invested in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina. So we're investing across Latin America. And I think the most important fact is, Latin American entrepreneurs, I think the only thing lacking was the ability for them to have more capital in order for them to grow. And what I love about Latin American entrepreneurs is because they didn't have access to capital, they have learned to run, I would say, a more responsible business in terms of always being concerned and always thinking of profitable growth than other entrepreneurs. And this is why you've seen the surge of tech IPOs in Brazil. And this is why you're seeing the creation of this new wave of entrepreneurs that are massively, disrupting traditional business models. You're seeing some of our e-commerce investments are growing 200, 300, 400% year over year. You have our on-demand logistics companies growing at incredible speed. You have all that growth. And then you ask yourself why, right? And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is Latin America has basically 250 million smartphone users in Latin America. That is the exact same numbers of smartphone users in the US. We have to enhance a little the connectivity. And lastly, Latin America has an incredible high internet penetration. We have over 600 million internet users in Latin America compared to 750 million users in China. So I think Latin America has the ecosystem that is necessary in order for these new technology companies to continue to disrupt and innovate the traditional business models.
So Marcelo, thinking of, as I listen to you, I can't help but think, one of the big questions that we're going to have going forward is how do we change the kind of social contract we have today? How do we deal with the poorest? I mean, if anything, this is the pandemic has shown just in front of everybody, the world over, the inequalities that exist in our societies. And you have big systems like education, like health, which truly not only have to be powered by technology, but there is a differential access. How do you see, in that landscape of innovators that you see around, the kinds of things that you can see today in education, which I'm sure is something that you're thinking about all the time? Because at the end of the day, this is a crisis in which we're riding on the new generations that are going to have to pay a much bigger price than we did as we adapt to the enormous fiscal infusions that governments have had to make. How do you see, for instance, education or health being transformed as a result through technology, more importantly through access, and what the governments have to do?
So I'll say that technology plus the pandemic that we're living is going to basically massively accelerate other trends that otherwise would have taken years and years. And I'll give you an example. I will take telemedicine, or better say AI-powered healthcare. Right, in the past, I mean, if you want to get proper healthcare in Latin America, in most countries, telemedicine was forbidden or is still forbidden. And the simple thought of you getting proper healthcare outside your traditional hospital was impossible. And therefore, you got probably one of the worst healthcare in the world is healthcare that you get in most of our Latin American countries. Unless you are a privilege to be able to afford a private hospital or private clinic, the quality of care that you get was pretty bad. And the same thing happened with education. The difference between a private school and a public school and the quality of education that you got, the disparity was so large, and it continues to be large. Now, what are we seeing in the pandemic? What we've seen all over the world is an immense acceleration of telemedicine. With today's technology, there's absolutely no need for you to go see a doctor. A doctor can prescribe you in many cases better and can diagnose you better if they're utilizing technology and they're doing it through telemedicine, if they're doing via Zoom or they're doing via video conference. So there's no need for people to go to the hospital anymore. Now, what we're finding in countries like China, and I'll give you the example in education, and I'll give you the example in education and medicine, In China, there's a huge amount of people who are basically being diagnosed or being prescribed utilizing technology. And basically, you have an enormous database in which you're asking a doctor, which in this case, it's an AI-powered doctor. It's not a person, but it's actually a server who has an advantage as they have 3, 4, 500 million patients or records that they have seen. So therefore, they're always going to diagnose you much better than a doctor who's seen 10, 12 patients a day, who hasn't had a chance to read the latest journal of medicine, who hasn't gotten the latest education. And what we're finding is that the level of misdiagnosis, when you're letting, call it a robot doctor per se, to be able to diagnose you, it is significantly different. It is 10 times more accurate. And because of the pandemic, because of the hospitals were so full, you're starting to see technology. I look at Latin America, first will be telemedicine, and then will be the utilization of technology. You find the same thing in education. What we're finding in education in China, we have a company we have invested called SoftBank that has close to 700 million users that are basically constantly getting additional courses, tutors, or basic education that is properly prescribed to them for what their needs are. So again, you're utilizing artificial intelligence in order to be able to act as, I would say, a more intelligent instructor who will always have the right answer, but who will focus in areas of improvement. I'm hoping that in Latin America, the same thing is happening. You have a lot of, telelearning or online learning, and we're seeing a change toward that sector. So we see, I'm a big believer that, technology plus the pandemic will have a massive change in technology. But Luis Alberto, let me now take it to you, since this is more about you as that is about us. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, as you said, we had amazing headwinds. I mean, when I started the fund in 2018, things looked great. We had incredible amount of headwinds. Things looked great in Latin America. Countries were growing. And then suddenly, not only do we have winds at a stop, but we have hit a wall and we're starting to go backward. And that because of the pandemic. And I wanted to ask if you see, are there any countries that could serve as an example in Latin America? And if so, which countries are they? And what are they doing right? Because we got to think of how do we get back to positive economic growth or ground in 2021. So I'm really curious to see, what are you seeing from a country perspective?
Well, there's been a variety of ways that different countries have gone about this, because the reality is that, this, for every country around the world, it's been learning by doing. And it is this very difficult balance between lives and livelihoods. And so you have countries like, for instance, Uruguay. What did Uruguay do different? They were, first of all, they had developed their own testing equipment. Secondly, it is a country that for years had already been massively connected. President Tabaré Vázquez, not in his last government, but in his first government, created a program called El Plan Ceibal. And that plan essentially was to provide, connectivity to schools, to use kids with laptops, and begin to provide not only the laptop, but more importantly, the programming that went into the laptop. And you could get Benedetti and the great Uruguayan authors and the history and everything else all at your fingertips. And these were programs that we helped develop at the bank. That essentially allowed them to have a lot of contact tracing. They were very disciplined in the way they not only closed, but then began gradually to open up. And of course, it's a small country, but they were very good at creating that discipline and that sense of social capital, if you want. That, this is a virus that attacks us all at the same time. It affects us differently, as we were saying earlier, because the poorest get hurt the most. But that's actually, like, for instance, a good example. You have other examples, which are big contrasts. Take the case of Brazil, which today has close to 55% of the cases, and the case of Peru. Peru did a lot of things right. It spent a ton of money reaching out to the poorest, preserving jobs, giving a lot of money through the so-called conditional cash transfer programs, but yet it was perusing formality that very quickly people started going to the streets very early, and the contagion just picked up. And in terms of numbers of deaths per million, they're one of the highest in Latin America. In Brazil, they have a larger number of cases, lower deaths, and it could be that over time they get closer to herd immunity than other countries. So there's not a perfect formula here. I would say that the only Asian-looking country probably is Uruguay in what they did. Costa Rica, another small country, began to do a lot of very good decisions. Chile very early on did a lot of things, and yet the virus spread significantly, probably because they opened too fast, they had to close again. So, there is no magic formula here other than the discipline that needs to exist at not only the federal level, if you want, but the state and local level. If they are not all coordinated, bad things begin to happen. And that's unfortunately some of the things that we've seen. On the other hand, there's been a lot of very good businesses, especially businesses that employ a lot of people, like in construction, like in civil works, in some of the consumer products, where they have been very good at managing, and industries at managing their labor force, making sure that back and forth when they're going home, that they're protected, and isolating people who have been with contagions, and those businesses have been able to continue to work. But the reality is that today we're in a moment where most countries are opening, and we are, of course, learning more as we go along. I think technology has been very important, especially on the contact tracing. And then let's not forget, one of the things that every country in Latin America did, because this came late to us, it allowed us to beef up our health systems. There's much more in the way of intensive care units. There is much more in the way of hospital beds. That's something we did not have at the beginning, that fortunately has allowed countries to manage the virus much better, especially for those who have gotten it.
So it was already it was already difficult enough for you to be the leading bank providing financing for growth. Suddenly, you have to reshift, right, and figure out how can you help governments in the region with the pandemic, with the economy. How does it change? Like, what is the bank doing now today to help with an area that wasn't part of the plan, which is help companies with the pandemic, help companies with the economy, or say help countries with the economy? How have you shifted, and give us some examples of what is the bank doing?
Well, this is a very good question, because I'm sure like happened with your business. I mean, we were already doing telework, and we had advanced significantly in all our IT space, but we were never trained to, from one day to the next, everybody be working from home. And fortunately, our IT systems and our IT teams were excellent and allowed us to all work from home. Then, as I'm sure has happened to you, the first thing that happens is that you learn that you must communicate a lot, that you must be in constant touch with people, because there is all this anxiety from people working from home. All of a sudden, people, started, the sense of mission and the sense of urgency, all of a sudden breaks down a lot of barriers, and people get very focused on the mission and task. And so we very quickly, the first thing we did is we understood that we had to entirely not only lend significantly more. Normally we lend to governments about 12 billion. We would normally do about 4 or 5 billion to the private sector. We'll be doing over 20 billion to both this year. And of course, disbursing very quickly. And the first thing was to say, okay, what do countries need tomorrow? And that was everything around the sanitary systems, from respirators, PPE, you name it, and trying to help countries buy goods and everything. And this was a very complicated process, especially in the early days. There was shortages throughout of all of these things. And then countries started to find ways even to produce them at home. You, I'm sure, have seen many of the cases of respirators that were produced in automobile factories. Every country was from 3D. Everybody was trying to do this. Then the other aspect was to say, okay, governments need help in dealing with trying to keep jobs, and that meant supporting medium-sized businesses. It equally meant supporting the poorest, and so we created a number of packages that governments could quickly use these prototypes to support either the poorest, or to keep jobs, or to support SMEs. And then that allowed us to essentially, we started in March, we basically ended up approving close to $9.5 billion between March and September, which was a huge number. And that meant that we were turning around projects extremely fast. And I have to say, all from our board down, all of our staff, everybody has worked tremendously well. And, here we are. We never thought this was going to be this long. People thought, well, maybe this is 2 or 3 months, and here we are. And more, we realized that we cannot even open our offices. We were hoping to do it this week, but we realized that we probably have to extend it for another number of weeks. And I'm sure that's not unlike what you're seeing in your own case. So this is a moment of tremendous adaptation, of trying to learn as we do. I think we put a lot of our efforts in doing research, in understanding what some countries were doing vis-a-vis others, some of the impacts. All of our research and our focus has been, of course, now as we go forward, in what does the recovery look like, and what do countries have to do as they think of the recovery.
So, Luis Alberto, I want to ask you a question that's an important question for me. You've been doing this job for 15 years. Prior to that, you were the Minister of Economy. And being in that job, you've met a whole bunch of characters: good leaders, bad leaders, okay leaders. And I'm intrigued by, now when you finish, they say, I always enjoy meeting President Bush when he can just tell me so many amazing stories of, and he doesn't care anymore, because he says, I'm not going to be president again, so I can just talk freely. And I'm not going to ask you for you to name who do you think were the best leaders. But what I'm interested is, having met so many of those leaders, is what is your take on leadership? How do you define leadership? And what are those qualities that make somebody a good leader, a good politician, a good businessman, but more importantly, above all, a good leader? So I'd love to just hear from you, what are those characteristics, and give us some insight into that.
Well, that's always a question. I guess everybody defines it. I think good leaders are made through life in different time periods. I don't know if it was your case, but I certainly wasn't the best student or the best sportsman in school. And I saw many people who were amazing A students, great sportsmen, and somehow that doesn't translate throughout life. And then there is that forming period, which is very important. And then when people get to positions of where they're really growing. And at the end, I would say is a number of things. It's how you approach decisions, and how do you see yourself in a job. I think always Hank Paulson, who's been a great mentor to me, always talks about having this notion of an expanded agenda in whatever is it that you do. In other words, it's not enough to say, look, the mission at hand is to do A, B, or C, but rather it is more that narrative that you want to bring an institution or whatever is it that you're doing to truly be transformational. And for that, the single most important thing is the people that you are able to assemble, and the capacity to give people direction and to equally empower them. Because, I don't think any leader is successful without a good team. Having good teams is central to, especially in today's age. And always, having the capacity to have people tell you the truth. I mean, sometimes leaders that quickly fall into trouble are those that shut out criticism, that don't allow themselves to hear and to listen, and always get out of the bubble. You need times to get out of that bubble that you normally are brought into. And when you get out of the bubble and just walk the street or be like any normal person, always be able to listen. I think these, to me, are some of the key characteristics. But at the end of the day, it is all about the instinct, the insights that you're able to manage it is to me more of that and less just pure rationality.
Thank you, Luis Alberto. And, as your presidency at the IDB comes to an end, what are the last words that you want to share? We have a lot of interested people who'd love to hear from you. And, and you're going to have a chance to, I would say, maybe say it more formally, but we have such an amazing audience here that would love to hear, hey, what are those last words? And what are those words of advice that you're going to leave us all with as you move on to all the other things in your life?
No, look, I think the single most important thing is we are going to be living one of the most different periods we have. I mean, we've been privileged all of these years as we grew up as having things that were very predictable. We're entering a phase of the world that is very unpredictable, that can go in many directions. And I think the excess, the amount of change that we're going to see, the amount of trial and error, the capacity to adapt are going to be the critical things going forward. And this is a lot of what you've lived in the technology space, where there's constant change. There's the way we work is going to be more collaborative. I mean, success will come with a lot of collaboration. It's less in very divisive spaces. And as society, we're going to have to live with that. We're going to have to learn to have patience. And this is not easy for human beings, and especially in this environment where there's a lot of tensions, family tensions, mental health tensions. But notwithstanding, I equally believe that humanity always through periods like this is when it becomes more creative, when it advances the most, and where a lot of opportunities come together. So that's how I see it.
Great. From my end, Luis Alberto, I want to thank you for your 15 years of service. They say that many times good leaders do stuff that they never knew they did. And it was that dinner that I had with you in DC that was the last push that I needed in order for me to go launch this large fund that is going to help, hopefully reshape Latin American entrepreneurs and Latin American technology. So you've played a key role. And it's fair to say that we all admire your work. We all admire what you've done and how IDB has been run as an incredible institution and one that's been respected and many times admired by many leaders around the world. So from our end, thank you. And we'll see if somebody wants to ask some questions. So thank you. Thank you, Susan, for allowing me to interview Luis Alberto.
No.
Marcelo. Thank you, Susan.
Well, I want to thank you, Marcelo, and I want to thank Luis Alberto. You're both dear friends, and you both have made your mark in Latin America and globally. And your leadership, both of your leaderships, are going to be so important to the hemisphere going forward. With that, let's open to questions. I have questions, but I can't ask them. I've got to let other people ask them first. So our first question comes from Stanley Mota. Stanley, can you unmute your phone and turn on your camera, please? Stanley? Stanley?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. You can okay, perfect.
Hello, Marcelo and Luis Alberto and Susan. Nice to see you, even if virtually. Just one quick comment, Luis Alberto. I recently read something about shutting out, and it basically said those who seek applause are not open to criticism. And I thought that was a simple way of putting it. So you might want to use that in the future. Because you've never looked for applause, you've looked for work. What really worries me going forward is what's after COVID. The way I'm looking at this has been a war. It's a strange war because it's a war where most of the deaths have been put by older people and not young people. And it's been a war where there's not property damage. If you go back and look at other wars, the Second World War first, or even the Vietnam War, the property damage was enormous. Here we're coming out of a war without. So what do governments have to do? And second of all, and really more specifically, I guess, what really worries me is we put a social network in a little, well or badly, but there is a social network being put out there. And what do we do about that in the future? because I'm not sure governments can sustain these subsidies without sort of reorganizing themselves completely. And Luis Alberto, you're looking at budgets and governments all the time. What are they going to have to do with the subsidies and the social network that has been added during COVID?
Because as you know well, every expenditure in governments has an owner, not necessarily the income, but the expenditure always has an owner. And as you say, there's been this huge amount of social safety nets built, which were definitely needed. Now comes the tough political challenge of taking those away as things normalize. And that happens at time. And I really believe that we're going to be through COVID, at least through parts of this, at least for another year, simply because by the time we get a vaccine, by the time people are vaccinated, by the time people are able to go and normalize their work. So we're going to enter that in a period which next year and the following year, we're going to have 13 elections in Latin America, and it's very easy to go back to our old habits. Which are all those habits? You know, inequality always provides a breeding ground for populism. Because it's that those social divisions that can be used as fodder for elections, and I think that's the tough part. I think equally is going to be critical to continue to look at how efficient these expenditures are, and there's a lot of inefficient expenditures. Many times, money that should go to the poorest that never gets to the poorest, but people perhaps that don't need it enough. Those are the kinds of things. Certainly technology is a way to make that more transparent, but we're gonna really need a huge amount of this conversation going forward, because otherwise we're just gonna, it's impossible to grow with that kind of fiscal deficit.
So our next question comes, hold on, from Moises Vidal from Bank of America. Moises.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. Luis, Marcelo, great information and excellent discussion, and thank you for your time. So my question is about what role will the private sector, including developing banks, play in ensuring that low-skilled workers and all the labor force in general continue to have employment and opportunities in the digital transformation time? What is your opinion about it?
I'm sure Marcelo has many ideas about this. I'll just very quickly. The biggest issue is, there is a big mismatch between, let's call them, the skills of the 21st century and the supply of jobs coming into the labor market. There's a tremendous mismatch. If you look at the manpower, any poll that is done across, and as I'm sure you have seen them, Moises, you have seen that there's like 50% of jobs that cannot be filled simply because the skills on the other side are not there. We're going to need to be very creative with this. And there's been a number of programs that we've done where you have a combination of skills training with internship companies, such that people can go through that and learn. And the digital skills are going to be central. And here I'm talking about the capability of writing code, the capacity to be digitally conversant. All of these things are going to be huge. I'm sure Marcelo can point to a number of areas where there's going to be an explosion of jobs in many of the companies that he mentions. There's huge amount of job openings all the time. And the question is how to grow them and how to make them better jobs. But I do believe that that's, where a lot, from a development bank perspective and a government perspective, where a lot of the focus has to come.
Yeah. So I'll just give you you're absolutely right. And humanity has an incredible resiliency to overcome any crisis, any revolution, any transformation. So, and I look at, we have to understand that there's a new world coming, a new world after the pandemic. We're pretty much I believe that things are never going to be the same. And crisis brings opportunities. and there's going to be a few companies where you're starting to create few companies that are going to be basically going to be the new employers, and it's not going to be your traditional companies. It's fair to say that pretty much everything the way we live is we're going to be redefined, and everything the way we work is going to be totally redefined. And it was already in the process of being redefined through technology innovation, but the pandemic has massively accelerated that. So how can we contribute? What are we doing? And there's something that we did with the IDB that was fascinating, right? We launched a program called DS4A, which basically meant Data Science for All. And basically it's a partnership between SoftBank and the IDB, in which our job is to upskill artificial intelligence talent in the region. And I keep on mentioning the word artificial intelligence because it is a reality that bringing machines to the intelligence to provide better decisions or to replace tasks that were traditionally being done by humans is something that is happening, and it is going to happen fast. So there's going to be, business are going to be different, right? I mean, traditionally retail was a big piece in terms of how we employ people. Well, in my personal opinion, retail is dead. Retail will never recover. And all of us who've had the incredible opportunity to buy most of our necessities via Amazon or via Mercado Libre in Latin America or via Alibaba in China, we are never ever want to go to a traditional retail store. So as we do that, we have a responsibility, both the private enterprise as well as governments, as well as like the Inter-American Development Bank, to change our focus and to make sure we put a lot more energy into basically educating our people for what the new jobs are going to be. So what are we looking for? We're looking for AI engineers or people who know how to code, that know how to optimize delivery routes for Ubers. Companies that have the ability to do, or students or engineers who have the ability to do new pricing modes for Rappi and others like that. There are some countries that get it, right? And I always like to say I love President of Colombia and the way he thinks and the way he sees how innovation and how the new level of disruption are going to basically change the way we do things. He launched a fund. It was called the Banco de Expand of Funds. And I was so impressed with the fact that a government is involved in funding early stage startups that I made a large investment from SoftBank perspective into a government-run venture of a fund of funds. That's unheard of. You will never ever invest or give money to a government who was going to run a fund of funds. But there are certain governments that get them. We're also working, hey, how could you train independent hotel owners in Latin America utilizing technology to prevent human trafficking, and so many other different amazing things. But I would say that we have a new world ahead of us. It's a totally different world. The pandemic and technology have massively accelerated the disruption of traditional business models. And I think also as leaders, we need to think of how can we educate our people to make sure they're going to be ready for those jobs. And to the government is how can the government utilize everything that they have in order to make sure that every citizen of every country is connected and have proper access to the internet so they can actually be brought forward to this new economy.
So with that, can I ask both of you, we have one more question that came in, and I also have a question because I know both of you are passionate about education. And even in the United States today, young people, kindergarten children, elementary school children, with parents that are home, they're technologically educated, are having trouble teaching children virtually and getting children acclimated to learning virtually. In Latin America, as you rightly point out, Marcelo and Luis Alberto, many people don't have connectivity. How do we avoid losing a generation of young people from an educational perspective as a result of the pandemic? How do we make education more inclusive and ensure that digital education reaches not just the wealthy, but the broader population so people aren't left behind? I know this is a topic that both of you care about. And the second question, which was sent to me is just a little bit elaborating on businesses that are founded by Latin Americans living in the United States and their expansion into Latin America. Is there an advantage to having founded a company in the United States as opposed to Latin America? Why don't we start with education? It'll run over a second, and I apologize, but I think both of these are important questions.
Well, real quick, and then turn it over to Marcelo. But look, I, as I'm sure you do, I talk to a lot of parents who have children going to either public or private schools, and they're really having a hard time.
Yeah.
Really say. And they're having a hard time depending on their age, because, it's, one of the most difficult things for learning is the discipline to learn. And that discipline comes not individually, but collectively sometimes. Teachers are able to do that. So we're going to have to enter some form of hybrid that is not just in the classroom experience, but equally connecting perhaps more universities. And at the same time, learning how to, use technology partially, but not all the time. And I think that uses of technology are going to stay with us. But one of the most difficult things is that probably one of the interesting things at the same time, speaking of Latin America, is that normally, especially when you go to the poorest areas, the parents believe that just because their kids are going to school, they're getting an education. Probably because they didn't have the chance to do that. This environment forces parents to be far more involved in the education of their children, which means that they must have far more flexibility in their work. But parents today are as much of a teacher as the teacher they have in the high school. And so how do we, how does the hybrid system evolve even, past the pandemic? And I think some of the things that should be able to pick up is that deeper interaction between parents and teachers. I think that is going to be central because now that process of education doesn't happen just in the classroom or in the school, but the parent is far more informed of whatever his daughter or son are doing. But in this period, unfortunately, I think we're going to lose a year. I mean, many kids are losing their academic experience this year.
Marcelo?
Thank you, Susan. And this is something that sits so close to my heart. I was one of the founders of One Laptop Per Child with Negroponte, which actually led to the Plan Ceibal in Uruguay. So I've been super passionate. And while being a Sprint CEO, I launched something that was called the 1 Million Project, which was basically to provide free internet connectivity and a free device to 1 million students. And now in the new merged company, we've actually launched a 10 million project because this problem doesn't affect Latin America. This problem even affects a developed country in the US where 9 million kids don't have access to connectivity and therefore they fail in school. And it's been great that we've launched this and we're very proud. And because it bothers me that most of the kids who don't have access to connectivity in the US are basically Latinos or Black. So totally, we're disadvantaged. Now, when you look at Latin America, like I said, when there's a crisis, there's an opportunity. And I think the fact that we are moving and we're going to have to move in Latin America, whether we like it or not, to a system of online learning till we can get past the pandemic, I think it brings an incredible opportunity because for the first time, the quality of education that everybody can get is going to be the same. The internet is basically democratizes education because everybody gets the same, right? It doesn't matter how rich or how poor you are. When you access the internet, when you type a word in Google, you basically get the same response. Doesn't matter. If you're poor, you don't get a worse response. If you're rich, you don't get a better response. And I think countries will have an incredible opportunity to be able to massify education, utilizing the best instructors to be able to provide that education. Because in online education, you don't have the limitations of how many people can attend the school or not. So I am hoping, that our Latin American leaders are going to learn how to make this current crisis that we're living to allow them to actually leapfrog education and not be backwards. And I think we have an incredible opportunity for SMART because machines have an incredible way of developing specialized curriculums for kids and all those things. So I'm hoping that will be the case. and we take this crisis as an opportunity to enhance the education that we have in Latin America.
Thank you. The last question, Latin American entrepreneurs. We've both seen Latin American entrepreneurs in the United States who have chosen to start their businesses in the U.S.
I think the best one to answer that is Marcelo.
Yeah. So I'll give you first my own personal example. I was very lucky to start a company who later became and still the largest Hispanic-owned business in American history, in U.S. history. And that was a business that I started in the U.S. and I expanded to Latin America and then expanded to 70 countries around the world. And you know, I might not answer you the right question, but I will tell you one thing that people ask me, and they say, "Hey, was it hard to start a business as a Latino?" And I always tell people that it wasn't. It was actually better, because I think Latinos, we have an edge, especially Latinos that are educated and are living in the United States, because we have the ability to belong to two different cultures and learn how to use each one to our advantage. So I think Latinos who start a business in the United States have the ability to be a Latino when they need to be, or have the American culture where they need to be, so we can be 2 times as powerful. So that was my story. And now that I am funding an immense amount of Latin American or Latinos or Hispanics in the United States who are starting their business, I said that they have absolutely nothing to envy to any other entrepreneurs. And we have an amazing wave of Hispanic entrepreneurs who are going to continue to do good. So thank you, Susan.
No, thank you. So Luis Alberto, you get the last word. In your last month at the IDB, what are you going to do next? What's your dream?
The first thing I want to do is take some time off. As you know, Susan, I've been in a very intense job. I've been 22 years here in DC, 7 as ambassador of Colombia, 15 at the IDB. So I'm just going to take some time off and think. I think it's good, and I'll try to figure out what comes next. In the meantime, I just want to be like Marcelo when I grow up. So I start with a beard already, and very relaxed, and looking forward to what comes. I think, the beauty thing about life is that you never know what comes next, and so I'm ready for it, and very excited and very proud of this period I've lived in, and thanking you and friends like Marcelo and others who have been in this call, who have had the privilege to work with so closely for all of these years.
So with that, I want to thank Marcelo. I want to thank you, Luis Alberto, for joining us today, giving this leadership discussion. You too, Marcelo. And Luis Alberto, you always have a friend in the Council of the Americas Society. You have a personal friendship with me, and we will always be here to help you and support you in your próximo paso de la vida. Entonces, muchas gracias a todos. Everybody that joined us today, be safe and enjoy, for you, Marcelo, the snow. Enjoy the last days of summer, and let's all hope for a good and safe fall and winter. Thank you again, Marcelo. Thank you for joining us. Luis Alberto, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.